The world didn't go black when the third bullet hit me. It went red. I remember the color distinctly. Not the crimson of blood, though there was plenty of that. It was the red of rage, of desperation, of a primal scream that tore its way out of my throat before I even knew I was making sound. I could smell the gunpowder mixing with the cloying sweetness of expensive perfume and the metallic tang of iron that flooded my senses. I looked down, not at my own ruined chest, but at the small trembling body underneath me. He was spotless, perfect, alive. His wide hazel eyes stared up at me, tears streaming down his cherubic face, his tiny hands clutching the front of my ruined uniform. "Mr. Kai," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Are you okay?" Before I could answer, a shadow fell over us both. The devil of New York, Lorenzo Caruso, dropped to his knees beside me. He didn't look at his crying son. He looked at me, a nobody Omega waiter bleeding out on a $10,000 Persian rug, my white serving jacket soaked through with red. He grabbed the paramedic's collar and screamed a command that silenced the entire room. "You don't let him die. He is my husband now. New York City doesn't care if you're tired. It only cares if you can keep up." For Kai Nakamura, keeping up meant a double shift at the Pierre, one of Fifth Avenue's most historic and expensive hotels. It was 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, and his feet were already throbbing inside the cheap black non-slip shoes he'd bought at a discount store 3 months ago. The insoles had long since worn flat, and every step sent a dull ache up through his ankles and into his calves. His uniform was stiff with starch, the collar rubbing raw against his throat, but he'd learned to ignore the small discomforts. They were luxuries he couldn't afford. The grand ballroom was suffocatingly hot, smelling of roasted duck, heavy lilies, and old money. This was the gala for the future, a charity event where Manhattan's elite pretended to care about the less fortunate, while wearing watches that cost more than Kai's entire life earnings. He'd been working these events for 3 years now, and he'd learned to read the room like a book. The women with the sharpest laughs were the ones with the emptiest marriages. The men who drank the most were the ones with the most to hide, and every single one of them would step over a dying Omega on the street without breaking their stride. "Table 4 needs more champagne. Move, Nakamura." The floor manager, a perpetually sweaty beta named Mr. Henderson, hissed into his earpiece. Henderson was the kind of man who'd been given a sliver of authority and had let it rot his soul. He hated Kai. Hated that an Omega had been hired in the first place. Hated that Kai was better at the job than most of his beta employees. Hated that the guests sometimes remembered Kai's face when they couldn't remember Henderson's. "On it," Kai whispered, adjusting the heavy tray on his shoulder. The champagne flutes clinked softly, a sound he'd grown to associate with exhaustion and the faint hope of tips he'd never see. He was 26, but he felt 60. His dark hair was pulled back so tight it gave him a headache, a requirement of the uniform, Henderson insisted. Kai suspected it was also because his Omega status made the manager uncomfortable. Omegas in high-end service were rare. Most were either kept safely at home by wealthy alphas or working in far less reputable establishments. The Pierre had only hired him because his references were impeccable and he'd agreed to work the graveyard shifts no one else wanted. But Kai didn't have the luxury of pride. He had a younger brother to support, and the American healthcare system was a shark that didn't care about secondary genders. He moved through the crowd like a ghost. That was the job. Be invisible. Fill the glass. Take the plate. Disappear. If a guest noticed you, you were doing it wrong. He'd perfected the art of being unseen, of moving through rooms full of people who looked right through him as if he were made of glass. It was a skill born of necessity, honed over years of being overlooked by everyone who mattered. He navigated past a cluster of socialites discussing their summers in the Hamptons. "So I told the contractor, if the marble isn't Carrara, tear it out." One woman in a red Valentino gown laughed, her scent a cloying wave of expensive Omega-marketed perfume. Her companion, an alpha with a face full of Botox and a chest full of silicone, nodded along as if she understood what Carrara marble even was. Kai tightened his grip on the tray. His own apartment in Queens had a leaking ceiling, a heater that worked only when it felt like it, and a landlord who threatened eviction every other week. He was 2 weeks late on rent, and his younger brother Toby needed new insulin before the end of the month. The last time he'd checked his bank account, he'd had exactly $43.17 to his name. "Excuse me." A deep, gravelly voice murmured directly behind him, and Kai froze. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking through the entrance wasn't just a man, it was an atmosphere shift. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air thickened, charged with something primal and unmistakable. The sheer, overwhelming presence of an alpha in his prime. Kai's omega instincts flared to life, his hindbrain screaming at him to submit, to bare his throat, to do whatever it took to placate the predator that had just entered the room. He was tall, wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. The fabric was so finely woven it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and the diamond cufflinks at his wrists caught the chandelier's glow like captured stars. His face was sharp angles and shadows, with eyes the color of cold espresso, dark, fathomless, and utterly without mercy. Dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and a jawline that could cut glass was shadowed with just a hint of stubble. His scent hit Kai like a physical blow. Sandalwood, and something darker, something dangerous, like gun oil and ozone before a storm. It was the scent of power, of violence barely contained, of a man who had killed and would kill again without hesitation. Lorenzo Enzo Caruso. Even Kai, who tried his best to ignore the gossip columns and had no interest in the underworld politics that dominated New York's elite circles, knew who he was. The papers called him a logistics tycoon. The streets called him the Capo dei Capi of the East Coast. He didn't walk, he stalked. Every movement was deliberate, economical, the kind of grace that came from years of knowing exactly how much force was needed to break a man's neck. And clinging to his hand was a small boy. The boy, Leo, Kai would later learn, looked about 6. He was a miniature replica of his father, dressed in a tiny tuxedo that probably cost more than Kai's monthly rent, but his eyes were wide and terrified. He clutched a small battered toy robot in his free hand, looking overwhelmed by the flashing cameras and the sea of strangers. His scent was pure omega pup terror, sharp and sour, and Kai's hindbrain screamed at him to protect the child. "No photos," Enzo said. He didn't shout, but the command was absolute. The paparazzi lowered their lenses instantly, and the socialites who'd been primping for the cameras scattered like startled birds. Kai watched from the shadows of the bar station, his omega instincts prickling with something he couldn't quite name. He saw the way Enzo's hand rested protectively on the boy's shoulder. Heavy, possessive, almost desperate. The alpha's knuckles were white, his jaw tight, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of constant vigilance. He loves the kid, Kai thought, but he doesn't know how to comfort him. It was a strange observation to make about a man who was essentially the devil walking among them. But Kai had spent years reading people, learning to anticipate their needs before they even knew they had them. It was what made him good at his job. And right now, he could see that Enzo Caruso was a man on the edge, barely holding himself together. The night wore on. The speeches began, interminable droning about building a better future from people who'd never known what it was like to worry about the future at all. Kai moved through the crowd, refilling glasses, clearing plates, his body on autopilot while his mind wandered to Toby. Was his brother remembering to check his blood sugar? Had he eaten dinner? The last time Kai had called, Toby had sounded tired, his voice thin and reedy, and Kai had felt the familiar weight of guilt settle onto his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was clearing plates at table 9 when he felt a tug on his apron. He looked down. It was the boy Leo. He had somehow slipped away from the wall of bodyguards surrounding his father's table. The guards were distracted, their attention focused on the perimeter, on the exits, on the senator who was currently bending Enzo's ear about some zoning issue. They hadn't noticed the little prince had wandered off. "I dropped Optimus," Leo whispered, his lip trembling. He fell under the table. Kai glanced around. The bodyguards were scanning the perimeter, distracted by a waiter dropping a tray near the kitchen. They hadn't noticed the small boy was gone. Kai crouched down, ignoring the protest of his knees, and peered under the heavy velvet tablecloth. The toy robot lay on its side, one plastic arm bent at an unnatural angle. It was an older model, well-loved, with paint worn away from years of being clutched in small, anxious hands. "Here you go, buddy," Kai said softly, retrieving the toy and wiping a speck of dust off it. He bent the arm back into place, careful not to break it. "Optimus Prime is tough. He can handle a fall." Leo's eyes lit up. He took the toy, clutching it to his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. "My dad says I have to be tough too." Kai's heart pinched. He remembered being 6, remembered his own father telling him to be strong, to not cry, to not show weakness. He remembered learning the hard way that Omegas didn't get to be soft, that softness was a luxury that could get you killed. "You can be tough and still need help sometimes," Kai said gently. "Even Optimus needs the Autobots." Leo stared at him, mesmerized. People usually spoke to him like he was either a fragile vase or a future king. Kai spoke to him like he was a 6-year-old boy with a broken toy. "Leo." The bark came from behind them. Enzo Caruso was standing there. Up close, he was even more terrifying. He loomed over them both, his eyes scanning Kai for threats, his alpha scent flaring with barely contained aggression. The pheromones rolling off him were enough to make Kai's knees weak, to send his hindbrain into a spiral of submission. "I'm sorry, sir," Kai said quickly, straightening up. He dropped his gaze, baring his throat slightly, an instinctive gesture of deference that he hated himself for. He just dropped his toy. "I was just..." Enzo looked at the toy in his son's hand, then back at Kai. His gaze lingered on the Omega's frayed collar, the dark circles under his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. For a second, the mask slipped, and Kai saw something unexpected in the Mafia boss's eyes: exhaustion. And something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Thank you," Enzo said stiffly. He placed a hand on Leo's head. "Stay close, Leo. I told you it's not safe." "Yes, Papa," Leo mumbled, his earlier sparkle dimming. As they walked away, Kai let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He checked his watch. 9:45. Just 2 more hours. Then he could go home, count his tips, and pray he had enough for Toby's insulin. He didn't know that in 15 minutes, money would be the last thing on his mind. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed at 10 o'clock. It wasn't something you could see. It was something you felt. The air grew static, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks over the Hudson River. Kai was near the service entrance, refilling water glasses for a table of investment bankers. His position gave him a view of the entire floor, including the VIP dais where Enzo Caruso sat. Leo was coloring in a book, bored out of his mind. Enzo was deep in conversation with a senator, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the exits, the kitchen doors, the balcony. He was a predator even when he appeared at rest. Kai moved to the next table, pouring water with practiced efficiency. As he straightened, he noticed a waiter he didn't recognize. The Pierre had a strict staff roster. Kai knew everyone, knew that Jose had a newborn, that Maria had a bad hip, that David stole mints from the front desk. He knew the rhythms of the kitchen, the hierarchy of the service staff, the subtle politics that governed who got the good tables and who got stuck with the drunks. But he didn't know the man moving toward the VIP table. He was walking too fast. Waiters are trained to glide, to be unobtrusive. This man was cutting a straight line through the crowd, his eyes locked on one target. He wasn't carrying a tray. His right hand was tucked inside his white service jacket. Kai frowned. What is he doing? Then he saw it. A flash of metal under the crystal chandeliers. A suppressor, the long black cylinder screwed onto the end of a pistol. Time seemed to warp. It slowed to a crawl. The gunman was 10 feet away from Enzo, but Enzo was turned away, laughing at something the senator said. The bodyguards were looking outward at the crowd, not at the staff. They assumed the threat would come from a rival, not a server. But the gunman wasn't aiming at Enzo. He was aiming at Leo. The realization hit Kai like a physical blow. They aren't trying to kill the boss. They're trying to break him. Kai didn't think. He didn't calculate the distance or the danger. He didn't think about Toby waiting for him in Queens, or the unpaid rent, or the fact that he was an Omega with no training and no protection. He only saw the small, terrified boy in the velvet chair, and he moved. He dropped the water pitcher. It shattered, a loud crash that should have alerted everyone. But the noise was swallowed by the orchestra playing a swell of Beethoven. He ran. He wasn't wearing running shoes. He was wearing slippery cheap plastic soles. He kicked them off as he sprinted, his socks sliding on the polished parquet floor. "No!" he screamed. The scream tore through the music. Enzo turned. The gunman raised the weapon. Kai threw himself forward. He didn't tackle the gunman. He was too far away. He did the only thing he could. He dove in front of the small boy, covering him with his own body. Foot. The first bullet hit him in the left shoulder. It felt like being punched by a sledgehammer. The force spun him around, and he felt something in his shoulder shatter, bone grinding against bone. The pain was so intense his vision went white for a moment. Foot. The second bullet tore through his stomach. This one burned, a hot, searing fire that made him gasp. He collapsed over Leo, wrapping his arms around the boy's small body, shielding his eyes. He could feel the warmth of his own blood soaking through his uniform, could smell it mixing with Leo's terror scent. Foot. The third bullet embedded itself in his lower back, inches from his spine. This one was different. It felt like lightning, like every nerve in his body was on fire. He felt his legs go numb, felt his body betray him. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt like an eternity. Kai lay slumped over the boy, his white uniform turning crimson. He could feel Leo shaking underneath him, his small hands clutching Kai's apron, his scent, pure Omega pup terror, flooding Kai's senses. "Stay down." Kai wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "Don't look. Close your eyes, sweetheart. Don't look." Then chaos erupted. "Man down. Secure the package." Gunfire returned from everywhere. Enzo's security team decimated the assassin in seconds. The fake waiter dropped, riddled with holes before his body even hit the floor. The shots were precise, professional, the work of men who'd done this before. Screams filled the ballroom. Billionaires scrambled under tables, overturning thousands of dollars of wine and food. Women in designer gowns shrieked, their perfect makeup ruined by tears of terror. Men who'd never lifted anything heavier than a golf club tried to push each other out of the way. But Enzo Caruso didn't move for cover. He vaulted over the table, ignoring the senator who was cowering on the floor, and landed next to the pile of white and red fabric that was Kai. His hands were shaking as he pulled Kai off his son. "Leo," Enzo barked. "Leo, are you hit?" The boy was covered in blood, but he shook his head, sobbing. "It's not mine, Papa. It's his. He saved me." Enzo looked at Kai. Kai was pale, his skin turning the color of ash. His breath came in short, wet rattles. His eyes were unfocused, staring up at the grand chandelier. He could feel his Omega instincts screaming at him, demanding he submit to the Alpha's dominance. But he couldn't muster the energy. The pain was too much, the blood loss too great. "Why?" Enzo whispered, his voice cracking. His hands pressed down on Kai's wounds, trying to stem the flow. "Who are you?" "Kai." Kai whispered, his voice barely audible over the sirens approaching in the distance. "My brother. Toby insulin. Please, he needs." His eyes rolled back. "No. No." Enzo roared. He placed his hands over the wound in Kai's stomach, pressing down hard. The blood oozed between his fingers, staining his diamond cufflinks and his bespoke suit. This was the blood of a peasant, mixing with the hands of a king. Enzo didn't care. He pressed harder, his face a mask of desperate fury. "Stay with me," he growled. "You don't get to die. Not like this. Not for me." Paramedics burst through the double doors, flanked by NYPD officers. They rushed toward the scene, but Enzo's bodyguards blocked them, guns drawn. "Let them through," Enzo commanded. The medics fell to their knees beside Kai. One of them, a seasoned EMT with a gray beard and steady hands, checked Kai's pulse and shook his head grimly. He's lost too much blood. BP is crashing. We need to transport him now. County hospital, another medic said. He's a Jane Doe, likely no insurance. We'll take him to county. County, Enzo snarled. County hospital was where people went to die in hallways. He took a bullet for my son. Protocol dictates. Protocol dictates nothing, the EMT said, his voice shaking. He's not family. We can't. Enzo stood up, and he looked like a demon rising from hell. He was covered in Kai's blood. He looked around the room. The press was there, the rival families were there watching, the world was watching. He needed to save Kai's life. But more than that, he needed to ensure that whoever sent that assassin knew that Kai was under his protection. If Kai survived this, the assassin would come back to finish the job. Unless he was untouchable. He doesn't go to county, Enzo announced, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. Take him to New York Presbyterian. Call Dr. Rossi. Tell him to prep the OR. Now, Dr. Rossi is a private surgeon. He won't operate on a waiter without authorization and upfront payment. The medic stammered. Enzo grabbed the medic by the vest, hauling him close. He is not a waiter, Enzo hissed, loud enough for the cameras to hear. He is my husband. My Omega. My mate. Do you understand? He is Lorenzo Caruso's husband. A collective gasp went through the room. The medic stared, dumbfounded. The press erupted into a frenzy of flashes and questions. The socialites whispered behind their hands. We didn't know you were married, Mr. Caruso. The medic stuttered, terrified. I am now, Enzo said, his eyes cold and hard as diamond. He looked at his head of security. Get the jet ready. If he dies, every person in this room dies. Every single one. Do you understand me? He looked back at the medic. You treat him like Lorenzo Caruso's husband. You treat him like the Queen of New York. You give him the best care money can buy. Do you understand? Yes, sir. They loaded Kai onto the stretcher. As they wheeled him away, Enzo scooped up Leo in one arm and walked alongside the stretcher, his hand gripping Kai's limp, blood-stained hand. He squeezed it. You don't get to die, Kai Nakamura, he whispered into the chaos. You owe me an explanation. And I owe you a life. The waiting room of the VIP wing at New York Presbyterian was silent, save for the hum of the industrial air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Enzo Caruso's Italian leather shoe against the sterile tile floor. It had been 4 hours. 4 hours since the doors to Surgery Suite 1 had swung shut, swallowing the dark-haired Omega with the frayed uniform and the broken toy robot. Enzo sat in a chair that was too small for him, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. They were scrubbed clean now. He had washed them in the bathroom sink until the water ran clear. But he could still feel the phantom warmth of Kai's blood. It was a sticky, accusing sensation that soap couldn't remove. Beside him, curled into a tight ball on a leather love seat, was Leo. The boy had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by trauma. He was wearing an oversized hospital t-shirt because his tuxedo had been ruined. Even in sleep, Leo's face was pinched, his eyebrows drawn together in a nightmare. His small hands were still clutching the toy robot, his knuckles white. Enzo had tried to take it from him, had tried to get him to eat something, to drink some water, but Leo had refused. He'd just shaken his head and held on tighter. Boss. Enzo didn't look up. He knew the footsteps. It was James, his consigliere and oldest friend. James had been with him since the beginning, had pulled him out of more firefights than Enzo could count. He was the only man Enzo trusted implicitly. James looked out of place in the clinical brightness, his gray wool coat smelling of the damp New York night. He carried 2 cups of coffee, one of which he pressed into Enzo's hands. Report, Enzo said, his voice a low rumble that didn't wake the boy. James sat in the chair opposite him, keeping his voice hushed. The shooter was a freelancer. Serbian national. No direct ties to the families. But the weapon was high-grade. Someone hired him to make it look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. But hitting the kid. James shook his head, his jaw tight. That was a message. They wanted to end your bloodline. They wanted to make you suffer before they killed you. Enzo's eyes flicked to the sleeping boy. A muscle feathered in his jaw. They failed. Because of him. Yes, James agreed quietly. Because of the Omega. Kai Nakamura. I ran his background. Enzo finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the exhaustion of the adrenaline crash setting in. Tell me everything. I want to know every detail. It's bleak, Enzo. James pulled out a tablet, scrolling through the files. Parents died in a car wreck 4 years ago. Drunk driver, no insurance. He dropped out of community college to take care of his younger brother, Tobias. Toby's 19, type 1 diabetic, brittle. He's been in and out of the ICU because they can't afford the good insulin or the continuous monitors. Kai works 60 hours a week at the Pierre and another 20 at a diner in Queens just to keep the lights on. He's 2 weeks late on rent. His landlord has already filed for eviction. Enzo stared at the wall, processing the information. He thought of the moment in the ballroom. My brother. Toby insulin. Kai's last thoughts hadn't been fear of death. They had been fear of failing his brother. He's alone, Enzo murmured. No one to miss him if he dies on that table. No one to protect him if he survives, James agreed. And that brings us to the other problem. The press. The video of you screaming that he's your husband is trending everywhere. It's on CNN, Fox News, the New York Times. The 5 families are calling. The commission is confused. If they find out you lied to get him into surgery, if they find out he's just a civilian witness, then he's a loose end, Enzo finished. The people who hired the shooter will finish the job. They can't leave a witness who saw the shooter's face up close. They'll kill him in his hospital bed. Exactly. Unless he really is my husband, Enzo said. The air in the room seemed to get heavier. James stared at him, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. Enzo, you can't be serious. You can't marry a stranger to clean up a PR mess. He's an Omega from Queens. He's nobody. The commission will never. He took 3 bullets for my son. Enzo cut him off, his voice cold. My own captains wouldn't have moved that fast. My own alphas wouldn't have moved that fast. They would have hesitated. They would have thought about the consequences. He didn't. He saw a child in danger, and he acted. Without thought. Without hesitation. Enzo stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the East River. The lights of the city glittered below, indifferent to the drama playing out in this sterile room. I owe him a life debt, James. In our world, a life debt is binding. And in our world, a bond is the strongest protection I can give him. If I mark him, if I claim him, no one will touch him. The families have rules about Omega mates. They're sacred. A bond. James stood up, his voice rising despite the sleeping boy. Enzo, you're talking about a mating bite. You're talking about spending the rest of your life with a stranger. You don't even know him. I know he saved my son, Enzo said quietly. I know he was thinking about his brother's insulin as he was bleeding out on the floor. I know he comforted Leo like he'd known him his whole life. I know he looked at me and didn't flinch. He turned to face James. That's more than I know about most people in my life. That's more than I know about you, some days. James opened his mouth to argue, but the doors to the surgery suite opened with a hydraulic hiss. Enzo turned instantly. Dr. Rossi, the chief of trauma surgery, stepped out. He looked exhausted, his surgical cap pulled low, his scrubs stained with blood. He stripped off his gloves, his expression unreadable. Enzo walked toward him, stopping 2 feet away. He didn't ask. He just waited. He's alive, Rossi said. Enzo let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders dropping half an inch. For a moment, the mask of the Mafia Don slipped, and he looked like just a man who'd been terrified of losing someone. But, Rossi continued, raising a hand. It was close. We had to remove his spleen. The bullet in the shoulder shattered the clavicle. We plated it. The real issue was the 3rd bullet. The spine, Enzo said. It missed the spinal cord by 2 millimeters, Rossi said, shaking his head in disbelief. If he had moved an inch to the left, he'd be a quadriplegic. As it stands, there's significant nerve trauma. He'll have mobility issues for a while, maybe months, maybe longer. He'll need extensive physical therapy, possibly for years. It's going to be a long, painful road. Will he walk? Eventually. With help. He'll need specialized care. Rossi lowered his voice. But Enzo, he lost a lot of blood. He was technically dead for 30 seconds on the table before we got the rhythm back. He's in a medically induced coma now to let the swelling go down. We'll wake him in 24 hours, but we don't know what the neurological damage might be. There could be memory loss. There could be. I don't care, Enzo said flatly. Whatever he needs, he gets. Money is not an object. Do you understand? Understood. Enzo nodded slowly. Move him to the penthouse suite. Private security only. No hospital staff enters without my men checking them first. I want the best nurses, the best therapists, the best of everything. If he needs a specialist flown in from Switzerland, you call me, and I'll make it happen. Enzo, the administrators are asking for the insurance papers, Rossi said nervously. And the marriage license. They need proof of kinship for you to make these decisions. If you can't provide documentation, they'll have to. Enzo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black checkbook. He didn't write a check. He just looked at James. James, Enzo said, his voice devoid of emotion. Call Judge McKinnon. Tell him I need a favor. I need a marriage license backdated to yesterday. And get the hospital administrator down here. I'm buying the wing. The whole wing. Enzo, that's... Did I stutter? James stared at him, then sighed, pulling out his phone. I'll make the call. Enzo looked back at the doctor. He wakes up as Mr. Caruso. He's moved into my penthouse suite. He has a full-time medical staff. And Dr. Rossi? Yes. If anyone tries to get near him who isn't cleared by me, I will personally hold you responsible. Do you understand? Rossi swallowed hard. Yes, Mr. Caruso. Completely. Enzo turned back to the window, his jaw tight. He watched the lights of the city flicker and thought about the Omega lying in the operating room. The Omega who'd thrown himself in front of a bullet for a child he didn't know. The Omega who'd been more concerned about his brother's insulin than his own life. Who are you, Kai Nakamura? He wondered. And why do I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life? Waking up was not like in the movies. There was no sudden gasp, no snapping open of eyes. For Kai, it was a slow, agonizing crawl through thick mud. First came the sound. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of a heart monitor, the hum of a machine breathing for someone nearby. Then came the smell, sterile, sharp, like bleach and expensive flowers. Then came the pain. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, heavy throb that encompassed his entire body, as if his bones had been replaced with lead pipes. He tried to move his hand, but it felt miles away. His thoughts were sluggish, disconnected, like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Easy, a voice said. It was deep, vibrating through the air like a cello string. Don't try to move yet. Kai forced his eyes open. The light was blinding. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog. He wasn't in a hospital room, or at least not one he had ever seen. The ceiling was high, painted with calming clouds. There were heavy silk drapes covering the windows. A crystal vase filled with white roses sat on a mahogany bedside table. He could smell the roses, could smell the faint trace of sandalwood that lingered in the air. He turned his head, the movement sending a spike of fire down his neck. Sitting in a wingback chair next to the bed was the man from the ballroom. Enzo Caruso. He wasn't wearing the tuxedo anymore. He was wearing a black button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms covered in dark ink, tattoos of thorns and geometric lines, the kind of ink that told stories of violence and survival. He looked tired. There was stubble on his jaw and a coffee cup in his hand. His eyes were shadowed, circled with exhaustion. Memory crashed into Kai like a tidal wave. The gala, the boy, the gun, the burning. Leo, he croaked. His voice was like sandpaper. The boy, where is he? Is he okay? Enzo's eyes softened just a fraction. He leaned forward, placing the coffee cup down on the nightstand. Leo is fine. He's at home, safe. He hasn't stopped asking about you. He keeps asking when he can see you. Kai closed his eyes, relief washing over him. Good. He shouldn't have seen that. He shouldn't have. You saved his life. Enzo's voice was firm. You have nothing to apologize for. Then the panic set in. Kai tried to sit up, but his body screamed in protest. Where am I? I have work. Toby, my brother. Stop. Enzo didn't shout, but the authority in his voice froze Kai mid-motion. He stood up and gently placed a hand on Kai's uninjured shoulder. You have been shot 3 times, Kai. You were in surgery for 9 hours. You are not going to work. You are not going anywhere. My brother. Kai gasped, tears forming in his eyes from the pain and fear. He needs his shots. He doesn't know where I am. The rent. I'm 2 weeks late, and my landlord. Your rent is paid, Enzo said flatly. Your lease is broken. Your apartment is packed. Everything you own is in storage. Kai stared at him, the drugs making it hard to process his words. What? And Tobias? Enzo continued, watching him carefully. He is currently in a private room at the Mount Sinai Center for Endocrinology. He has a new continuous glucose monitor, a dedicated nurse, and a treatment plan paid for the next 5 years. He's been asking about you. I told him you were on a business trip. The room went silent. The only sound was the beep 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 of the machine, picking up speed as Kai's heart rate climbed. Who gave you the right? Kai whispered, fear creeping in. This wasn't charity. Men like Enzo Caruso didn't do charity. Why would you do that? Enzo sat on the edge of the bed. He was too close. He smelled of danger and power, and beneath it all, something warm and almost comforting. An alpha pheromone that made Kai's omega instincts want to lean in and submit. It was overwhelming, the scent of him, and Kai had to fight the urge to bare his throat. Because, Enzo said, locking eyes with him, you are my husband. Kai laughed. It was a weak, hysterical sound that turned into a cough. I'm hallucinating. The drugs. No hallucination. Enzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it up, a marriage certificate. Lorenzo Giovanni Caruso and Kai Nakamura, dated 2 days ago. Kai stared at it, his mind reeling. The ink was fresh. The signatures looked real. But he'd never signed anything. He'd never agreed to this. I don't understand, Kai whispered, his voice shaking. I never signed this. I never agreed to marry you. This can't be legal. I signed it for you, Enzo said calmly. It's legal. The judge owed me a favor. Several favors, actually. He was happy to oblige. Why? Kai demanded, finding a spark of anger in the exhaustion. Why are you doing this to me? I saved your son. Is this how you thank me? By kidnapping me? By forcing me into a marriage I never wanted? Enzo's face hardened. He stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy drape. The lights of Manhattan glittered below. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking out at the city he ruled. The man who shot you was a Serbian mercenary, Enzo said, his back to Kai. He was hired by one of my rivals. I don't know which one yet, but I will find out. He failed his mission. The people who hired him are angry. They know you saw the shooter. They know you interfered. If you walk out of this hospital as Kai Nakamura, the waiter, you will be dead in 24 hours. They will find you in your apartment in Queens, and they will kill you. And they will probably kill your brother, just to be thorough. They don't leave loose ends, Kai. They don't take chances. Kai felt the blood drain from his face. The machine beeped faster. But they won't touch Mr. Caruso, Enzo continued, turning around. In my world, husbands are off limits. It is the oldest rule. If I claim you, if I bond with you, you are under my protection. The entire underworld knows you are mine now. To touch you is to declare war on the 5 families. And no one wants that war. He walked back to the bed, looming over Kai. His scent was stronger now, more intense, and Kai could feel his omega instincts warring with his fear. I didn't do this to trap you, Kai. I did it to keep you alive. You saved my son. Now I am saving you. Kai looked at the certificate, then at the man. He was terrifying, yes. But he had also secured 5 years of medical care for Toby. Something Kai had prayed for every night for 4 years. Something he'd never been able to afford on his own. So what happens now? Kai asked, his voice trembling. I just pretend. I play happy husband to a mafia boss. There is no pretending, Enzo said. You will live in my house. You will wear my ring. You will be a father figure to Leo, who is currently too traumatized to speak to anyone but me. And in return, you and your brother will never want for anything again. Never worry about money again. Never worry about insulin again. He reached into his pocket again. This time, he pulled out a ring. It wasn't a delicate band. It was a massive vintage emerald-cut diamond surrounded by smaller diamonds. It looked heavy. It looked like a shackle. But it was also beautiful, catching the light and throwing rainbows across the ceiling. "Give me your hand," he said. Kai hesitated. He looked at the door. It was closed. He looked at his legs, hidden under the sheets, numb and useless. He thought of Toby, safe in a private clinic. He thought of the years of struggle, the endless nights working double shifts, the fear of losing his brother to a disease he couldn't afford to treat. He slowly lifted his right hand. Enzo slid the ring onto his finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for him. "Welcome to the family, Kai," he whispered. Just then, the door creaked open. A small head peered around the frame. "Papa." It was Leo. He was holding the toy robot. Enzo turned, his face instantly softening. "Come in, Leo." "He's awake." Leo walked hesitantly toward the bed. He looked at Kai, his eyes wide and fearful. He saw the tubes, the pale skin, the bandages visible at the edge of the hospital gown. "Did I break him?" Leo asked, his voice wobbling. "Is he hurt because of me?" Kai's heart broke. Despite the pain, despite the forced marriage, despite the fear of the Mafia Don standing over him, he smiled. "No, sweetie," he whispered, reaching out his hand, the one with the heavy ring. "I'm not broken, just under repair." Like Optimus, Leo rushed forward and buried his face in the side of the mattress, careful not to touch Kai's wounds. He was crying now, his small body shaking with sobs. Kai rested his hand on the boy's soft hair, his omega instincts purring with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "You saved me," Leo whispered. "You were so brave." "You were brave too," Kai said softly. "You stayed quiet. You didn't cry until it was over. That takes a lot of courage." "My dad says courage is doing what's right even when you're scared," Leo mumbled. "Your dad is right," Kai said. "And you were very courageous." Enzo watched them from the foot of the bed, the waiter and the air. He knew he had made a deal with the devil to keep Kai safe. But looking at them now, he realized the danger wasn't just from the assassins outside. The danger was that for the first time in 10 years, since his first husband died, the ice around his heart was starting to crack. And in his world, feeling was a weakness that got you killed. Discharge Day was a military operation. There were no flowers or balloons. Instead, there was a sweep of the hospital corridor by 4 men in dark suits who spoke into their wrists. Kai was transferred from his bed to a wheelchair, his body stiff and aching, wrapped in a cashmere coat Enzo had provided. It cost more than his car. It was also the softest thing he'd ever worn. "We move in formation," James, the consigliere, instructed the team. "Eyes open. The elevator is held. No one approaches without clearance." Enzo stood by the window, watching the street below. He turned only when Kai was settled in the chair. He didn't smile. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. "Ready?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. "Do I have a choice?" Kai replied, his voice weak, but carrying a trace of his old defiance. "No," Enzo said simply. "But you'll have more choices than you've ever had in your life. I promise you that." The ride to the estate was silent. They sat in the back of an armored Cadillac Escalade, separated from the driver by a partition. The glass was an inch thick, bulletproof. The rain hammered against the windows, distorting the lights of the George Washington Bridge as they crossed from the city into the dark, wealthy cliffs of Alpine, New Jersey. Leo sat between them, clutching his robot. His head rested on Kai's thigh. Every time the car went over a bump, Kai winced, his hand tightening on the leather armrest. His nerves were still healing, and every jolt sent fire down his spine. Without looking at him, Enzo reached out and adjusted the heated seat controls on Kai's side. "The heat helps the nerve pain," he murmured. "I had the car modified. The seats are heated throughout. I can adjust them from here." Kai looked at him, surprised by the small gesture of kindness. You've been shot before? Enzo stared straight ahead at the rain-slicked road. 3 times. Once in the shoulder. Twice in the leg. I know the feeling. He paused. It feels like ants crawling inside your bones. Like your nerves are on fire. The heat helps. It takes the edge off. It was the first personal thing he had shared. It was also a reminder. I am a violent man. You are in a violent world. Thank you, Kai said quietly. For everything. For Toby. For the hospital. For all of it. You saved my son, Enzo said, his voice gruff. I'm just repaying a debt. Is that all this is? Kai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A debt? Enzo didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The car slowed as they approached a set of massive iron gates. They were 12 feet high, topped with herms that looked medieval. Security cameras swiveled to track the vehicle. The gates groaned open, revealing a winding driveway lined with ancient oaks that looked like skeletal fingers in the headlights. The Caruso estate was not a house. It was a monolith of limestone and glass, rising from the cliff's side like a fortress. Beautiful, cold, and intimidating. It was the kind of building that was designed to make you feel small, insignificant, powerless. And it worked. As the car stopped under the portico, a line of staff was already waiting. Maids, a butler, a chef. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, eyes lowered. They didn't look up as Enzo stepped out of the car. They look like they're afraid of you, Kai whispered. They are, Enzo replied as the door opened. Fear keeps order. Order keeps us alive. Enzo stepped out, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't wait for the driver to help Kai. He leaned into the car, sliding his arms under Kai's knees and back. I can. Kai started to protest, but the movement sent a jolt of electricity down his spine. He gasped. You can't, Enzo said, lifting him effortlessly. Don't fight me, Kai. You have no center of gravity. You'll fall, and I won't let you fall. He carried Kai up the grand staircase. Kai could smell the scent of him, rain, expensive tobacco, and something sharp, like gun oil. His head rested inadvertently against Enzo's chest. Enzo's heart was beating slow, steady, like a metronome. It was the heartbeat of a man who was never afraid, who had faced death and stared it down. Inside, the house was silent as a tomb. The floors were black marble, reflecting the crystal chandeliers above. It was devoid of clutter, no family photos, no stray shoes. It was a showroom, not a home. It was the kind of house that had never known warmth. Leo, go with Martha. She has your dinner, Enzo commanded. But I want to stay with Kai. Leo protested. Kai needs rest. Go. I'll bring you to see him in the morning. Leo slumped but obeyed, following an elderly housekeeper. Enzo carried Kai to the second floor, down a long gallery hall, and kicked open a set of double doors. The room was vast. A fireplace crackled on one wall. A king-sized bed with a canopy dominated the center. But what caught Kai's eye was the wheelchair waiting by the bed, sleek, titanium, modern. It was the kind of chair that cost more than most people's cars. Enzo placed him gently onto the duvet. He lingered for a second, his face inches from Kai's. For a moment, Kai thought he might say something kind, something gentle. This is the East Wing, Enzo said instead. My rooms are connected through that door on the left. You do not lock that door. Ever. Kai bristled. Excuse me? I have a right to privacy. I'm not a prisoner. You have a right to safety. Enzo corrected, his voice dropping an octave. If you fall, if you choke, if you have a seizure from the trauma, I need to be able to get to you. You are not a guest, Kai. You are an investment I am protecting. A very valuable investment. He straightened up, fixing his cuffs. Dinner will be brought to you. Dr. Rossi will visit in the morning for your PT. Don't leave this floor. If you need something, press the button by the bed. Someone will come. He turned to leave. Enzo. He stopped at the door, hand on the brass knob. Thank you. Kai whispered, looking at the fire. For Toby. For everything. I know you didn't have to do any of this. Enzo didn't turn around. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the price tag of this life. You haven't seen what it costs to be a Caruso. He closed the door. Kai listened to the click of the latch. He was safe. He was wealthy. He was married to the most powerful man in New York, and he had never felt more like a prisoner. A week passed in a blur of agony and rain. Recovery was not a straight line, it was a jagged spiral. The mornings were the hardest. The nerves in Kai's lower back would scream as soon as he tried to shift weight. His days were regimented. At 8 a.m., a maid brought a tray of fruit and oatmeal he was too nauseous to eat. At 9 a.m., Dr. Rossi arrived with a physical therapist named Helga, a beta woman with hands like steel grips who showed no mercy. "Push, Mr. Caruso." Helga would bark as Kai gripped the parallel bars set up in his room, sweat dripping down his face, his legs shaking violently. "If you don't use the muscles, they atrophy. Do you want to be in the chair forever?" "I'm trying," Kai gritted out, his arms trembling with the effort. "I am trying. Try harder. Your husband didn't pay for a luxury spa retreat. He paid for recovery. Now push." Enzo was rarely seen during the day. He was a ghost in his own house. Kai would hear the helicopter taking off from the lawn at dawn, taking him to the city. He would hear the heavy thud of the front door late at night. But he felt Enzo's presence, the fresh flowers that appeared daily, the upgraded pain medication when Enzo noticed he was suffering, the way the staff treated Kai with a terrified reverence. The only bright spot was Leo. The boy had ignored his father's rules about letting Kai rest. Every afternoon, he would sneak into Kai's room with his backpack, sit on the rug beside his wheelchair, and read to him or play with his transformers. He would show Kai his drawings, explain the complicated lore of the Autobots and Decepticons, and ask endless questions about what it was like to live in Queens. "Papa says you're broken because of me," Leo said one rainy Tuesday, snapping a plastic wing onto Starscream. "He said I should have been more careful. He said it was his fault, too." Kai was sitting by the window, watching the gray ocean of the sky. He turned the wheelchair around. "Come here, Leo." The boy walked over, his eyes downcast. Kai reached out and took his small hands. "Look at me. I am not broken. I am healing. And it wasn't because of you. It was because of a bad man. You didn't pull the trigger. You didn't do anything wrong. Papa says it's his fault too. That he wasn't careful. That he should have seen it coming." Kai sighed, realizing the weight the man carried. "Your papa thinks he controls the sun and the moon. But he can't control everything. No one can." "Papa doesn't smile much," Leo said quietly. "He used to smile more. Before Mama died." Kai's heart ached. He didn't know much about Enzo's first husband, but he could imagine the pain. "I'm sorry, Leo. That must have been very hard." "It was," Leo said. "But I'm glad you're here now. You make Papa's eyes look less sad." That night, the house was particularly quiet. A storm had knocked out the power grid in the town, and the estate was running on backup generators. The lights flickered and hummed. Kai couldn't sleep. The pain in his back was a dull roar, and his thoughts were restless. He maneuvered himself from the bed to the wheelchair, intending to go to the en-suite bathroom for a glass of water. Then he heard it. A scream. High-pitched and terrified. "Leo." It was coming from down the hall. Kai didn't think. He wheeled himself to the door, pushed it open, and rolled into the dark corridor. "Leo," he called out. Another scream. "No. No. Don't." Kai spun the wheels, ignoring the pain in his shoulders. He reached the door to Leo's room. It was ajar. Inside, the boy was thrashing in his bed, tangled in the sheets. Caught in a nightmare. Kai rolled to the bedside. "Leo, wake up. It's okay. You're safe." He reached out to shake Leo's shoulder. Suddenly, a shadow loomed in the doorway. A gun clicked. "Step away from him. Now." Kai froze. He looked up. Enzo was standing there, a Beretta leveled at his chest. He was shirtless, wearing only silk pajama pants. His body was a map of scars, knife wounds, bullet holes, burns. He looked wild, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, his alpha instincts in full predator mode. "Enzo, it's me," Kai whispered, holding up his hands. "It's just me. He's having a nightmare. He's scared." Enzo lowered the gun instantly, letting out a sharp curse. He engaged the safety and tossed it onto a chair, then rushed to the bed. But he didn't know what to do. He stood over the thrashing boy, his hands hovering helplessly. "Leo," Enzo commanded, his voice harsh. "Soldier, report." "Wake up. Stop it," Kai hissed. "He's not a soldier. He's a child. He's scared." He pulled himself out of the wheelchair. It was a stupid move. His legs weren't ready. They buckled immediately. "Kai." Enzo lunged, catching him inches from the floor. His arm wrapped around Kai's waist, pulling him flush against his bare chest. Kai grabbed his shoulders for stability. Enzo's skin was burning hot, his muscles hard beneath Kai's hands. For a moment, they were frozen there. Kai's broken body supported entirely by Enzo's strength, their faces inches apart in the dim light. Kai could feel the hard lines of Enzo's abs, the scar tissue on his ribs, the frantic beat of his heart. He looked up into those dark eyes. They weren't cold anymore. They were wide, frantic, and human. "I've got you," Enzo whispered. His voice was rough. "I won't let you fall." "Help him," Kai whispered back, nodding at the bed. "Please, put me on the bed with him." Enzo hesitated, then lifted Kai and placed him gently on the edge of Leo's mattress. Kai immediately pulled the crying boy into his arms, cradling him against his chest. "Sure, Leo, I'm here. I'm right here. Optimus is here. The bad guys are gone." He rocked him, humming a lullaby he used to sing to Toby, an old Beatles song, Blackbird. It was soft and gentle, a melody that had soothed his brother through countless nightmares. "Blackbird singing in the dead of night," Kai sang softly. "Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise." Enzo stood in the shadows, watching. He watched this Omega who was in agony comfort his son better than he ever could. He watched the way Leo's breathing slowed, how he unclenched his fists and buried his face in Kai's neck. He watched Kai's scent, soft, warm, nurturing, envelop the boy like a blanket. It was the scent of safety, of home, of everything Enzo had never been able to give his son. Enzo felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the war he was fighting. It was shame, and it was gratitude, and something else, something he hadn't felt in years, hope. After 20 minutes, Leo was asleep, his breathing even, his face peaceful. Kai was exhausted, his head drooping, his eyelids heavy. Enzo walked forward. He didn't say a word. He just picked Kai up from the bed, carrying him bridal style. "I can take the chair," Kai murmured sleepily against his shoulder. "No," Enzo said. "You'll fall. I won't let you fall." He carried Kai back to his room and laid him down on the bed, pulling the covers up over him. But he didn't leave immediately. He sat in the chair beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of Kai's chest. "The night my first husband died," Enzo said into the darkness, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. "He was in the car with me. We were coming home from a charity event. They rigged the ignition. I got out. He didn't. I watched him burn." Kai turned his head on the pillow, looking at Enzo's silhouette. "That's why you're so hard on him," he realized. "You think if you make him tough, he won't break like your husband did." "I think if I make him tough, he won't need me," Enzo corrected. "Because one day, my luck will run out. And he will be alone. I won't be there to protect him." "He's not alone anymore," Kai said softly. "He has me now." Enzo looked at him. The moonlight caught the ring on Kai's finger, the ring that had belonged to Enzo's grandmother. It glinted in the darkness, a symbol of the life Kai had been thrust into. "No," Enzo said, standing up. "He isn't." He walked to the door. "Get some sleep, Kai. Tomorrow, the tailor is coming. The gala for the mayor is in 3 days." "I can't go to a gala," Kai protested. "I can't walk. I can barely stand." Enzo paused at the door. "You are Mr. Caruso. You don't need to walk. You just need to sit on the throne I built for you, and let them see that we are not afraid. That we are stronger than ever." He opened the door. "And Kai." "Yes. The next time you hear a noise in the night, don't come out. I almost shot you tonight. I could have killed you." "I know," Kai said. "But I couldn't let him suffer alone." Enzo stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharply, and closed the door. But outside in the hallway, Enzo Caruso leaned his forehead against the wood and took the first shaky breath he had taken in years. He could still smell Kai's scent, could still feel the warmth of his body in his arms. He was falling, and he was terrified. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was closed to the public, transformed into a glittering cavern of gold and velvet for the mayor's annual ball. This was the lion's den. Every major crime boss, corrupt politician, and ruthless CEO in New York was in attendance, sipping champagne and plotting wars behind polite smiles. For Kai, the entrance felt like walking, or rather, rolling, to the gallows. He wore a custom-made suit of deep crimson silk, designed to drape elegantly over the wheelchair while concealing the surgical brace around his waist. His dark hair was swept up, revealing the diamond necklace Enzo had fastened around his neck an hour ago. It was cold against his skin, a heavy reminder of who he belonged to now. "Head up," Enzo whispered, his hand resting firmly on the handle of Kai's wheelchair. He was a wall of black wool and tension behind Kai. "If they smell fear, they bite. Keep your chin up. You are a Caruso now. I'm not afraid of them," Kai replied, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I'm afraid of tripping over this suit." "I won't let you fall," Enzo said, his voice low. "Never again. I promise you." The double doors swung open. The hum of conversation died instantly. Enzo Caruso didn't sneak in. He pushed his husband into the center of the room, challenging the world to look at them. And they did. They looked at the Omega who had taken 3 bullets and survived. They looked at the waiter who had become a queen. They whispered behind their hands, their eyes wide with curiosity and envy. Kai felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. He saw the pity in some faces and the predatory calculation in others. He saw the alphas sizing him up, wondering if he was a threat or a weakness. He saw the Omegas assessing his dress, his jewelry, his place in the hierarchy. "Caruso," a voice boomed. Vincenzo Russo, the head of the rival Brooklyn family, stepped forward. He was a large man smelling of cigars and arrogance. He held a glass of scotch, his eyes flickering over Kai's wheelchair with mocking sympathy. "A tragedy," Russo said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "To see such a beautiful flower broken in the pot. Tell me, Enzo, is he just a decoration now? Or can he still perform?" The insult hung in the air like toxic smoke. Enzo's grip on the wheelchair tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. He stepped forward, his eyes darkening into murder. "Careful, Vincent," Enzo growled. "You're treading on dangerous ground." "I'm just asking a question," Russo said, spreading his hands. "We all want to know. Is your Omega functional? Or is he just a pretty face in a chair?" "No, Enzo," Kai said softly. "Let me handle this." He unlocked the brakes of his wheelchair, gripping the armrests. He gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his spine, using every ounce of strength he had built during those agonizing therapy sessions with Helga. He pushed himself up. The room gasped. Kai stood. He was shaky, swaying slightly. But he was standing. He looked Vincent Russo in the eye. He was almost as tall as him in his heels. "I am not a decoration, Mr. Russo," Kai said, his voice ringing clear. "And I am not broken. I am the Omega who shielded the Caruso bloodline with my own body. I am the one who took 3 bullets and lived. What have you done lately besides hide behind your men and your scotch?" Russo's face turned a mottled purple. He opened his mouth to retort, but Kai wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto the gold lapel pin on Russo's jacket. It was a small, unique design, a serpent eating its own tail. A flash of memory hit Kai. The kitchen at the Pierre, the waiter who had shot him. Before he had put on his jacket, Kai had seen him adjusting his tie. He had worn a tie clip with that exact same symbol. "The serpent, Enzo," Kai said, his eyes never leaving Russo's. "The man who shot me. He wasn't a freelancer. He was working for Vincent. I saw the symbol on his tie. The serpent." The silence that followed was absolute. Enzo looked at the pin. Then he looked at Russo. The realization was instant. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. "You broke the truce," Enzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You targeted a child. And you shot my husband. You broke every rule we have." "He's a waiter," Russo sputtered, stepping back, realizing he had been exposed by the one person he thought was helpless. He's nobody. You can't. He is a Caruso, Enzo declared, his voice cold as ice. He is my mate, my omega, my everything. And you will pay for what you did. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. He simply nodded to the shadows of the room. Dozens of men, security, waiters, even the band members, stepped forward. Enzo's network was everywhere. Leave, Enzo whispered to Russo. Go home and say goodbye to your family. You have until sunrise. Don't make me come find you. Russo fled, his entourage scrambling behind him. The room erupted into whispers, but the balance of power had shifted. The King of New York hadn't just won, his queen had won it for him. Later that night, back at the estate, the adrenaline finally faded. Kai sat on the edge of the bed, the red suit pooled around him on the floor. He was exhausted, his back throbbing, but he felt a strange, vibrating energy. He'd stood up. He'd faced down a mob boss. He'd won. Enzo walked in. He locked the door, the one connecting their rooms. He walked over to Kai, kneeling on the rug so he was looking up at him. He took Kai's hands. They were trembling. You stood up, he said, awe in his voice. You stood up and you faced him down. You were magnificent. I had to, Kai whispered. He was disrespecting us. He was disrespecting everything you've built. Us. Enzo looked at the ring on Kai's finger. Then he looked at his face, stripping away the layers of the Mafia Don, leaving only the man. You said US. I did, Kai said. Because it's true. We're a team now. Whether I like it or not. Enzo laughed. A low, surprised sound. It was the first time Kai had heard him laugh. We had a deal, Enzo said hoarsely. A marriage for protection. A fake life. A transaction. I know. Kai said, tears pricking his eyes. Is the deal over? Am I safe now? Can I go back to my old life? You are safe, Enzo said. He reached up, his thumb grazing Kai's cheekbone. But the deal is void. I'm ending it. Why? Kai asked, his voice cracking. Why would you do that? You could have just let me go. Because I don't want a fake life anymore, Enzo whispered. I don't want to pretend. You took 3 bullets for my son, Kai. You stood up tonight and faced down my greatest enemy. But more than that, you make me feel like I'm not a monster. You make me want to be better. He leaned in, his forehead resting against Kai's. I love you, he breathed. Real, terrifying love. I love you, Kai, and I don't know what to do with it. Kai closed his eyes, letting the tears fall. He thought of the lonely apartment in Queens, the struggle, the invisibility. He thought of the endless nights working double shifts, the fear of losing his brother, the weight of a world that had never given him a chance. Then he thought of Leo sleeping down the hall, and this dangerous, broken man kneeling before him, offering him everything. I think, Kai whispered, leaning into his touch, that I love you too. And I don't know what to do with it either. Enzo kissed him then, gentle, desperate, and full of promises. It was the kiss of a man who had been alone for too long, who had never expected to find someone who saw past the monster. It was the kiss of a man who was terrified of falling, and falling anyway. They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together on the bed, holding each other in the darkness. Enzo's scent wrapped around Kai like a blanket, warm and safe, and Kai let himself relax for the first time in years. You can sleep here tonight, Enzo murmured against his hair. If you want, I'll sleep on the couch. No, Kai said, surprising himself. Stay here. Stay with me. Enzo pulled him closer, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I won't let anyone hurt you, he promised. Not ever again. I swear it on my life. Outside, the rain began to fall on the fortress. But inside, for the first time in a long time, it was warm. The days that followed were unlike anything Kai had ever experienced. He was a Caruso now, in every way that mattered. The staff addressed him as Mr. Caruso. The security team deferred to him. Enzo's associates called him the boss's husband, with respect in their voices. But more than that, he had become part of a family. Leo had blossomed under Kai's care. The boy was no longer the timid, frightened child who'd clutched a toy robot at a charity gala. He laughed now. He played. He ran through the halls of the estate, his laughter echoing off the marble floors. He even smiled at his father, sometimes, though Enzo still struggled to express his affection. "Papa doesn't know how to show love," Leo said one afternoon, as they were putting together a Lego spaceship. "He's never had anyone to show love to. Not since Mama. But he loves you," Kai said gently. "I can see it in everything he does. He wants to protect you. He wants to keep you safe." "I know," Leo said. "But he doesn't hug me. Not like you do." Kai's heart ached. "I'll hug you enough for both of us," he promised. "I'll hug you so much you'll be sick of it." And he did. He made sure Leo knew he was loved, every single day. Enzo watched from a distance. He watched Kai read bedtime stories to Leo. He watched Kai help with homework. He watched Kai laugh at Leo's terrible knock-knock jokes. And he felt something inside him shift, something that had been frozen for a decade, slowly thawing. One night, after Leo had been put to bed, Enzo found Kai on the balcony overlooking the city. Kai was wrapped in a cashmere blanket, the lights of Manhattan glittering below. "Can't sleep?" Enzo asked, stepping out into the cold air. "Too much on my mind," Kai admitted. "I keep thinking about Toby. I haven't seen him in weeks. I don't know if he's okay. I don't know if he's eating properly, if he's taking his meds, if he's—" "Kai." Enzo stepped closer, his hand resting on Kai's shoulder. "Toby is fine. I've had my people checking on him every day. He's eating. He's taking his medication. He's even made friends at the center. He asks about you every day." Kai turned to look at him, his eyes glistening. He does. He does. He told James that he's never been so healthy in his life. He said he feels like a real person for the first time." Kai laughed, but it was a choked sound, half sob. That's all I ever wanted for him. Just to feel normal." "I know," Enzo said softly. "I know how much you've sacrificed for him. I know how hard it's been. But you don't have to sacrifice anymore. Not ever again. You have everything you need now." "I have you," Kai said, looking up at him. "That's what I have." Enzo's heart clenched. He stepped closer, pulling Kai into his arms. "Yes," he whispered. "You have me. Forever." They stood there in the cold, holding each other, the city spread out below them. And for the first time in his life, Kai felt like he belonged somewhere. The months that followed were a whirlwind of recovery and growth. Kai's physical therapy continued. Helga pushed him harder than ever, and slowly, painfully, he began to walk again. First with a cane, then without. His back still ached, and he would never be as fast or as strong as he once was. But he could walk. He could run. He could play with Leo in the garden, chasing the boy through the hedges. Enzo watched him recover with a fierce pride. He hired the best doctors, the best trainers, the best everything. He was there for every therapy session, holding Kai's hand when the pain was too much, pushing him forward when he wanted to give up. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," Enzo told him one night, after a particularly grueling session. "I've seen men break under less pressure. But you just keep going." "I don't have a choice," Kai said, exhausted but smiling. "I have people counting on me. Leo. Toby." He paused, looking up at Enzo. "You." Enzo leaned in and kissed him, slow and deep. "I am so grateful for you," he murmured against Kai's lips. "Every single day, I am grateful." "I'm grateful for you too," Kai whispered back. "For giving me a chance. For seeing me as more than just a waiter from Queens." "You were never just a waiter," Enzo said fiercely. "You were always more. I just didn't know it yet." Life at the estate became normal, in a strange way. There were still threats, still security protocols, still the constant vigilance that came with being married to a Mafia boss. But there was also warmth. There was love. There was laughter. Leo had started calling Kai Papa without even thinking about it. When he realized what he'd said, he froze, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "Don't be sorry," Kai said, pulling him into a hug. "You can call me whatever you want. As long as you're happy, I'm happy." Enzo watched the scene from the doorway, his heart full. He had never expected to find this. A family, a partner, a reason to keep fighting. He had accepted loneliness as his fate, had resigned himself to a life of violence and isolation. And then Kai had appeared. Kai, who had thrown himself in front of a bullet without hesitation. Kai, who had seen the monster in Enzo and loved him anyway. One evening, Enzo took Kai to the roof of the estate. The city stretched out before them, a glittering expanse of lights and possibilities. I brought you here for a reason, Enzo said, his voice unusually nervous. I wanted to ask you something. Kai turned to him, curious. What is it? Enzo dropped to one knee. I know we're already married, he said, pulling out a velvet box from his pocket. I know it was a fake marriage, a transaction, a way to protect you. But I don't want it to be fake anymore. I don't want to pretend. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, different from the one Kai already wore. It was simpler, more elegant. A band of platinum, with a single diamond that caught the light. I love you, Kai Nakamura, Enzo said, his voice rough with emotion. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to be your husband in every way that matters. Tears were streaming down Kai's face. You don't have to ask, he whispered. I already said yes. I'll keep saying yes. Forever. Enzo slid the ring onto Kai's finger next to the other one. Then he stood up and pulled Kai into his arms, kissing him like he was the only thing that mattered in the world. I love you, Enzo said against his lips. I love you, I love you, I love you. I love you too, Kai said, laughing through his tears. I love you so much it scares me. Good, Enzo said. We'll be scared together. That's what makes it real. And that is the story of how Kai Nakamura went from invisible to invincible. It wasn't the bullets that defined him, or the diamonds, or the title. It was the choice he made in a split second to protect an innocent child. It was the courage he showed every single day after, facing a world that had never given him a chance. In a world full of monsters, he proved that the strongest heart isn't the one that pulls the trigger, but the one that stops the bullet. He didn't just marry the boss. He became the partner he never knew he needed. He became the heart of the Caruso family. He became the reason Enzo learned to love again. The waiter was gone. The queen had taken his throne. And they lived, not happily ever after, because there were still battles to fight and enemies to face. But they lived with love, with hope, and with each other. And that was more than either of them had ever dared to dream.